Welcome to the lecture on Sustainability, Ethics and Technology. This is the first lecture in a series of 2 lectures. My name is Behnam Tayebi, and I'm with the Group of Philosophy at Delft University. Today's lecture is about 3 subjects. I will first present to you a brief history of sustainability. I will then move on and discuss the concept of sustainable development as it has been discussed in the literature. And I will present several challenges from a philosophical point of view to this notion. Let me start with the discussion of the history of sustainable development. It all started over 40 years ago with a report written by the Club of Rome. The report had the title, The Limits to Growth, and it was written by a group of concerned scientists. The report was arguing that the post-Second World War paradigm of growth was something that could not be continued. Because growth was not endless, we had to consider certain limitations for 2 reasons. Firstly, the growth was based on finite resources that could run out. And secondly, the growth has certain ecological impacts. The second step in the history of sustainable development was a presentation of the report, Our Common Future. The then Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, presented in 1987 a report in which the first systematic definition of sustainable development was presented. The definition goes as, sustainable developments are developments that meet the need of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own need. The second important step in this development was the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. This was important because it was for the first time that a version of sustainable development entered policymaking. That was the precautionary principle. The Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro presented an Agenda 21, a blueprint of an action on global, national, and local level to reduce greenhouse gases. However, the Earth Summit was a non-binding agreement. It was voluntary. The next important step in these developments is the IPCC and the reports that they regularly publish. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change observed in 1996 that there is a discernible human influence on climate. In 2001, they reiterated this argument by observing that there is a stronger evidence that most of the warming is attributable to human activities. Also, in their most recent report, the IPCC makes this observation and reiterates this conclusion. In 1997, Kyoto was presented as an amendment to the Rio Earth Summit of 1992. Kyoto was meant to reduce and stabilize greenhouse gases, but again, Kyoto was a voluntary agreement. The emission trading system is something that was presented in the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto lasts until 2012, and an extension of Kyoto is in effect right now. The discussion of sustainable development is grounded on a dilemma. This is called the growth dilemma. Because on the one hand, there were the no-growth lobbyists that were arguing, and the no-growth lobbyists were mainly actually representatives of the developing countries, that we should actually continue growing to be at the same level or at the comparable level as the industrialized countries. On the other hand, the problem of sustainable developments, of the problems that sustainable developments observe, was something that was stemming from growth. So what the Brundtland definition did was an attempt to offer a solution out of this dilemma. It did imply that we should consider limitations, but no absolute limitations. So the definition goes, limitations on environmental resources and by the ability of the biosphere to absorb the effect of human activities. So again, there should be limitations, but those are not absolute limitations. Let us focus on the Brundtland Commission for a moment. Let me repeat the definition first. Sustainable developments are developments that meet the need of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own need. There are several questions that could be asked with regard to this question. There are several questions that could be asked with regard to this definition. First of all, what does the notion of need exactly entail? What is it that we as the present generation need, and what does future generation need? Can we simply say that we should or we could coincide our and their needs, or are there conflicts to be addressed? This goes back to something that we call the tragedy of the commons, which is the title of a very influential paper written by Garrett Hardin. The tragedy of the commons is a case of a prisoner's dilemma. It is a situation in which it is in the collective interest of all parties to cooperate, while it is not in every party's individual interest, while it is in individual interest not to cooperate. So again, the prisoner's dilemma is a situation in which it is best to cooperate, collectively speaking, while individually speaking, the best solution would be not to cooperate. Let me elaborate on this for a second. This is a typical situation of a prisoner's dilemma. Two people have been arrested for a crime. If none of them would confess, none of them could be convicted for that crime. So there are two strategies that each party could follow. To cooperate would be to remain silent, or to defect, that would be to confess and to accuse the other one. If both parties would cooperate, both parties will be sentenced to jail for 1 year. However, if one of them starts confessing and says, it wasn't me, but the other one did it, that party would be in a much better position because that is the party that will be released, while the other one will be sentenced to 20 years jail because there is a witness for the crime. So if both parties will confess, the two of them will be sentenced to a longer period of jail than when the two of them will not cooperate. So this is a prisoner's dilemma because this is a situation in which, that collectively speaking, it is better for both parties to cooperate. However, if you would be the only party that is not cooperating, you will be better off because you are the one who will be released. How does this relate to the tragedy of the commons? The tragedy of the commons is a thought experiment. The commons of pastures, the commons are actually pastures and parties are individual herdsmen. So to cooperate would be to take as few as possible cattle, and to defect would be to take as many as possible cattle. In this thought experiment, which is about Boston Commons, there is a very harsh winter, and individual herdsmen need to decide for themselves how many cattle they take to the pastures every day. So if all of them would take all the cattle every day, the pasture will not survive until the end of winter, which means that none of their cattle would survive until the end of the winter. So they need to consider limitations. However, if everybody would comply, if everybody would cooperate, while only one individual party would defect, the only individual herdsman that is defecting and bringing all his cattle every day to the pasture is the one who is better off. This is a typical prisoner's dilemma in a situation of the tragedy of the commons. What are the commons when we talk about environmental developments? The commons are actually things that we hold in common. There are at least two important issues: the non-renewable energy resources, like oil and gas, and the environment as such, including the atmosphere. Those are the things that we hold in common. So the tragedy of the common argues that we should accept limitations to our action and to our freedom in order to maintain the commons for all. While the tragedy of the commons as presented by Garrett Hardin mainly discusses spatial issues, that would be issues with regard to the space, the tragedy of the common also has a temporal issue, that would be a time dimension. So the same questions about the things that we hold in common do relate to the things that we hold in common together with people who come after us or future generations. The distinction between spatial and temporal is something that comes back at the very fundamental level of the definition of sustainable development. Social justice grounds the notion of sustainable development, and sustainability is supported by three main pillars. First, a fair spatial distribution of well-being among contemporaries, that is referred to as intergenerational justice. Second, a fair temporal distribution of well-being between generations, or intergenerational justice. And third, sustainability as something that refers to the relation with the nature. I will come back to this third issue in the second lecture on sustainability. There are several challenges to the notion of sustainable development. I'm going to mention two of them. First of all, there is the ignorance problem. Ignorance meaning not knowing. So the problem is that we do not exactly know what people in the future need. It is hard enough to try to anticipate what we as the present generations need, let alone that we have to discuss that for people who do not exist yet. We don't even know who the people in the future will be. The second problem is referred to as the distance problem. To which future people do we owe obligations? And to what extent do we owe these obligations? Would it be exactly the same obligations as we owe to people present right now? Or could it be less? And if it's less, based on what grounds? This is again an issue that I will discuss in a second lecture on sustainability in more details. So there are challenges to the notion. However, we could assume that there will be people in the future whose interests can be affected by us. We could also assume that they need at least cleaner water and a protected climate. So again, assuming that all of us have access to the same environment and resources in a temporal sense, so us and people in the future, it is reasonable to consider certain limitations on our action to protect their interests as well. However, the question remains, how far in the future should we care, and whether it is legitimate, it is acceptable to make a distinction between different people in belonging to different generations. To conclude, in today's lectures, I presented the notion of sustainability as a notion that relates to a fair distribution of resources and well-being, both spatially and temporally. Sustainable developments are developments that meet the need of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own need. This is a definition presented by the Brundtland Commission. The definition has, again, a spatial and a temporal dimension, and it is particularly the temporal intergenerational aspect that raises several important and interesting philosophical challenges. Thank you for your attention.